consistently restore your SP so you
All right, I think I'm live on both YouTube and on Twitch, from what I can tell. If anybody is watching, which I have no idea anybody is, you can tell me if the audio is actually working correctly or not. Appears everything is. All right, so what I just wanted to do today, as kind of an experiment of even doing this for one, was I spend a lot of time kind of looking at things even before I blog about them or as I create videos. And one of the things that came up this week that kind of spurred an idea was a post on Twitter. Let me see if I can actually find this post. So, it was something that I replied to. Where was this at? Here we go. So this original post here was about when designing an aggregate route, do you eager load all navigation properties? Is there any articles or pointers for practices around this? And then kind of CC, Julie Lerman, and Steve Smith, and I'm assuming both of those because they both have a site or a course on Pluralsight related to domain-driven design. I actually spoke to Steve a couple weeks ago for the new Loosely Coupled show that I have, which is also on YouTube. That the episode actually with Steve, the first one we recorded, is actually going to get posted today in about a couple hours. I think it's scheduled for maybe 2 or 3 o'clock. So I seen this. I replied to it, which was I think I also seen it because Jimmy Bogard replied to it, and is kind of how I seen this whole thread. Which is, for myself, I piped up here. I don't know where my reply is. Somewhere. Right here. Which was, or don't use aggregate roots for reads and only use them for writes. So to kind of how I go back to this original question, because I'm making some assumptions here. One is that they are referring to when they're talking about eager loading all navigation properties. They're talking about an ORM. Specifically, they're talking about Entity Framework or Entity Framework Core, where if you have navigation properties in your kind of object model that you by default in Entity Framework, like the original one, you would have everything by default would be lazy loaded unless you include, i.e. eager load, those navigation properties. So otherwise, everything would be lazy loaded. And then because they mentioned Julie, that's where I'm going with the whole. It's related to Entity Framework. So for myself, I generally don't think of using AggregateRoots for reads. Generally, what I do, hence my reply here, is I really only use them for writes. And when you kind of go down this road, it doesn't mean that you can't use Entity Framework for both. I remember hearing many years ago, I can't remember who it was from, to kind of this notion of not using your AggregateRoots for reads and just going directly to the source or whatever the model is of the data that you want for your reads, which is generally what I tend to do. So in a CQRS kind of style app here, my commands, yes, will oftentimes, in some circumstances, if I'm using AggregateRoots, they will use a repository that will fetch out that aggregate root. But in doing so, how you get that data and whether you want to eagerly load that data is kind of dependent on the context of what you're doing in the aggregate root. So if you have, say, some method, some behavior that's about whatever, I don't know, like you have some behavior in it where you need to deal with some kind of list or collection within that kind of that object model, then yes, you know, for example, if we're talking about a shopping cart and line items, then yeah, you're probably going to eager load those line items because if you have something like add item to cart, then you need to add something to it, or you probably need to iterate over them in some particular way. You're going to want to eager load those things. Maybe you don't, because depending on I would argue most systems are probably more read heavy than they are write heavy. So if you are going to lazy load, I guess it would be up to you to determine how much of implication that has by lazy loading and making those additional queries. So what I wanted to do when I thought about this was to try to find an example of something, or either create an example of an app, or pulled something down from GitHub. Maybe that does this or doesn't do this, kind of in the way that I'm talking. And so what I did was I cloned eShop on web. So this is from .NET Architecture. Steve Smith actually pointed this out to me. I think he's probably I know he's a contributor to it. I don't know if he's the primary contributor or not, but so what I wanted to do is kind of look through it, and because I know that I believe it's using EF. I know it's kind of using the concept of entities and repositories from what I looked at earlier. So I'm just going to kind of peruse in here, and hopefully I can find some information about whether this is doing it or not. And ultimately, why I'm just streaming this is because I was planning on doing this anyways, and related to probably some content that I will create, either a video or a blog post or both. So let's dig in here and let's look for a repository, which we got order repository. Let's make this a little bit bigger so everybody can stream, see this. All right, so this is the order repository that is using EF repository, which I think we just seen back here. So you could kind of think of this as a quote-unquote probably generic repository, which is a different topic altogether, whether I think this is useful or not. But this get ID with items async is the crux somewhat with what I'm kind of referring to, which makes a lot of sense, is providing this, if you want, like whether you are going to use this for queries or not, the fact that we're doing eager loading here. So we're going to eager load the items and the items ordered. It's kind of a little bit weird, this name of. But that we have a method that actually dictates that we actually are, you're going to eager load it, as opposed to probably just calling the get itself that existed in EF repository. Let's see here. So the get itself probably obviously isn't going to do any eager loading, and then you'd be lazy loading order items if you actually end up starting to use those. So this is actually a fairly decent example of using it this way. Let's see if we can find what these look like. So this is our order aggregate. So this is what we're actually loading from that order repository. So this is going to be loaded if we load it from EF. This is likely the constructor we're going to be using if you're creating a new instance of it. The idea here being is that you are using this constructor. This is kind of a good practice. Using the constructor to kind of set up this order in a valid state right from the get-go. Meaning that it absolutely has to have a buyer ID, it has to have a ship to, and you're likely going to give it a list of items and some null checks here. So this is just good practice of just making sure you get into a good state. And then this one's a fairly decent example of, unless this is used for some logic, which I'm going to assume is not, I'm going to assume this total is used for read purposes. The one thing I do mention about a repository is that I generally only use them for exactly this, which is building an aggregate root. And if you're not using your aggregate root for queries, then what you end up having in your repositories are essentially one method, or maybe in this case two, was just the get, which is going to basically get your aggregate root out. So let's see how they're doing some web stuff here. So they're using mediator. So this is interesting. So let's get my orders. So let's see how this ends up getting used. I'm assuming that was actually probably API, maybe not. I should just pull this down and then I could probably find. I'm guessing pretty good on where this stuff is. All right, so this is our actual query object from Mediator. So this is the name of it, get my orders. If you're unfamiliar with Mediator, it's kind of like a dispatcher for commands, but as well as for queries. So this request, this type parameter here is what is actually going to be returned from the handler. So there's going to be basically a single handler that will handle receiving requests about this particular request. I like to call them messages, they're queries. So it's going to return an IEnumerable of this order view model. So here was the handler for it. So yeah, this is what you think is going to happen. That's what I thought was going to happen, is that we are going to be using our aggregate root to pull this data and to build our output, our order view model that we're going to be returning here. So we take a dependency on order repository. We're creating some specification, which we're going to use that within our order, this list async, which this list async was on the base class there that we were extending, which was the EF repository, I think it was called. So we're basically going to use that aggregate root essentially to build all this out. What I should have done here is I should have cloned this, because so the command side of this probably makes sense if, like, in terms of changing stuff with this, because it's just gonna actually, that's a good question, what the command side was doing. Anyways, moral story, what I would have done here more likely is not use the repository, what I more likely would have done was directly in here used the database context, whichever one. So the EF context, I would have injected into here, and I would have made my actual query fetch this particular, whatever this query is, whatever this specification is doing ultimately, like probably something by username. Now, the benefit with doing it this way, I will argue, is that you're creating a specification of like how you want to fetch that data, that's what this is creating. So that's kind of encapsulate that logic of what this is. The only thing that the reason why I like separating this is because if you have two different models for what orders is, you don't like, the idea being is that the model that you're using for your writes and your reads can be completely different. Now that's not to say that they can't be, that they have to be different physical like models stored differently, meaning you don't have to have, when people say like you have different models, that doesn't mean that the actual storage for those models has to be different. A good example of this would be you could have two different database contexts, like EF contexts, that map, like use the same data models that map to the exact same tables. But the fact that you have two different data models means that you can add various methods to each different model that may be applicable to one. Maybe you don't actually map to a table, but you map to like a view, for example. And guess what your view is? Your view really just is a projection of whatever it is relationally in the different tables that you have that you want to create. So you can have these views or these different models that may look very similar. They may not look similar. But the point being is that I personally prefer to go directly to the source and distinguish my write model and my read model, even if they may intertwine and end up being to the exact same thing. I'm really more curious to see what this customer item specification does. Or not. Customer orders with item specification. Where was that thing at? Can only guess this is in outside of web. Web would depend on application core. Specifications. I'm guessing pretty good here. So this is best space specification. That includes, so it's doing a bunch of, I see, it's doing a bunch of EF stuff on it. So base specification has this, and this is going to be our entity, and we're just basically going to provide at this point our includes to eager load this, and then we're going to eager load that. So the only thing with the specification that I'm curious of is it feels like, and maybe this is just a simplistic example. So yeah, we got include, so we can deal with eager loading and whatever, but I'm curious of how you deal with, for paging, that's great. But for basic select, like what you're actually projecting to, like what you actually want to select. Because, for example, if you're doing this very often, again, this is a sample app. It's not the be-all, end-all. So let me go back to features, my orders, this handler. I mean, in this particular circumstance, you probably do want everything. But let's say, maybe I can find a different example where all we really wanted was the, I don't know, one particular piece, maybe the order date. Like, you're not going to want to pull this entire order out to do that. Even if you had a specification that wasn't doing the includes, sure, but how do you specify, like, you don't want the individual, like, you don't want the entire order, you just want the date. So I'm curious to how Is there something on the repository that would do that a little bit more? Let's see how they're doing that. Let's go back to here. Yeah, EF repository. So we got the specification, which we seen. That was this one. So it's basically applying all that include and gunk. This is kind of typical stuff, but I'm not seeing where you would define in the specification what you want to select. Like what data you actually want back. That's the apply that we're using everywhere else here. Because you're not going to want back the object itself. And that's what all these are doing. These are all assuming that you're getting back the entire entity. Which makes sense. Again, that makes sense when you're using this as an aggregate root, right? Like you want the entire object model back. And I'm going to jump back to this question, which I think this one person may have viewed it differently than I did. So this person wrote in reply to that same thread, the responsibility is to protect invariants. Agree. To this property, you must always load the full aggregate. Now, I agree. That hence why I'm saying if you're using this order repository, repository, and however you're fetching it out with a list, specification, whatever the heck is going on there, you're going to be getting back out what this T is, which is going to be like your order, your aggregate root. So again, we agree. This is one reason why you should not use this pattern for reads. Totally agree. Because you likely don't want to fetch out the entire aggregate root. You probably only generally want pieces of it, or you want to project it in a different way. A good example of this may be that, again, you could have a view or something that did the count of maybe you want to care about the total line items, maybe you want to care about the total order value. Instead of fetching that data, the line items, and summing them up in memory, maybe you are doing that via a link against this, you know what I mean, against the actual records themselves. It's just really not efficient to have to be pulling the aggregate root down entirely to do all that. And again, this implies the use of CQRS and separate read model. So yeah, on the money with this one. When I originally read this yesterday, I didn't think we were on the same page, mainly because to do this properly, you must always load the full aggregate root. Where I was going, and I think I replied to this, is saying that originally, I'm agreeing with that entire thing, but the idea was, the person was originally asking was, do you eager load them or not? So if I really go back to the original question is, do you eager load all these navigation properties? And the fact is if you don't, you're just going to lazy load them anyway. So no matter what, if you're using this EF repository, you're using the aggregate root, whether you do includes or not to eager load, once the moment that you use that line items, if you didn't eager load it, you're going to be lazy loading it. So the idea that you're getting the entire aggregate root is true no matter what, because you can't not get it. The moment you use a navigation property, you're using it. I guess I should pay attention to my actual streams here to see if anybody is in here. Yeah, there are a couple people. Hello, whoever's watching. As I'm completely new to this, I'm trying to get used to keeping one monitor open here where chat is. I wonder if there's an easy way to keep, because I'm streaming both to YouTube and Twitch, so I gotta figure out how to do this so I can see all the comments a little bit easier. All right, so I think maybe what I will do, because this actually is a really good example, is I will probably end up, I already forked this, so I think I'll pull it down probably, and then do exactly what I'm referring to, which is take one of these features, one of these queries, and not use the aggregate root. Oop, not there. I want to go into features. But otherwise, this this eShop on web is, for the most part, I think very in line with how I would do things generally. There's some more organizational differences, I guess, but they're more so minor than anything. I tend to combine, and this, to a lot of people, this will sound absolutely insane. And I realize that. And every time I kind of do some of my vertical slice or CQRS talks, I always have comments afterwards about what I'm about to say may seem extreme to some people because they're not used to doing this. Is this model right now is basically one file, like one class per file. I throw that out the window. Generally, what I'll do is the actual query object itself, so this one, this actual request, I will put in the same file the request, so this file, the handler, this file. Well, they'll be together. I'll put that separate, that other class, the actual query itself, up here. As well as I will take this portion out here and put this piece of the puzzle in it as well. So essentially this portion, never mind this detail one. So I would have this particular class with this controller for this particular route. I would have this in, so I would essentially have 3 classes in that one particular file. The benefit for me for doing this is not having to jump around. Generally when I'm dealing with something, you know that, oh, I'm looking for the my orders. I will literally in Rider search for the my orders type, and I just end up in one file that has the query, the handler, the route, and whatever else, the view model that it's all associated to, rather than kind of jumping around in files and folders. Personal preference, or my team does that. And I think maybe it might have been adjustment for, probably an adjustment for everybody, getting used to it, but it feels a little bit more natural. So Karsten's writing, wouldn't this also mean that T would have to be tracked entity since it can be saved instead of a projection? Pretty well, exactly, right? So the way around that in EF is, yeah, you do a select new and what your anonymous type's going to be, and then that automatically, from what I'm aware, won't be tracked. Or if you are going to select the entire entity, you have to use as no tracking, like that extension, or that, I don't know, I think it's probably an extension method. But either way, so you're calling that method on the DB set. So yeah, you're tracking stuff that you're only using for reads. And again, this is an example, so it's probably, I don't know. I still think for my example, I'm going to take, for my blog post, or maybe I'll do a video on this, is refactoring that query to not use it at all. And what I maybe go to the extent of probably creating a separate DB context. And maybe for the sake of argument, I may use something like, I may change, let's see what's actually in this view. Curious if it shows like a total or something. My orders, let's see what this thing shows. Number, so there's a total on here, and that total, if I remember correctly, was iterating over the line items. I should just have this in Rider right now, and it'd be easier to jump around. Instead of lesson learned, I'll do this next time in Rider, rather than just being in GitHub on the web here. What was I going to do? I was going to go look at the order itself, right? So what was total? So total was a method that was, so they were probably using this and then setting that in the view model. Let's go back to web, features, my orders. What were they setting total to? Yeah, so they were just calling the method total. I mean, this one's pretty close because it is listing all the line items anyways. I mean, you pretty much need the entire set to produce what this is. but with the caveat of Carson just said is you're tracking it for no reason. I guess the argument could be made here that you could probably do some of that, or you can include that with the specification in some form or another, or do that when you're using the repository in some way that you could define that, hey, I don't care about tracking this, so you could do as no tracking. I guess that would probably could be the argument. Yeah. I wish there was a different example. Maybe there's a different example in here about something where it doesn't really, like this could it just happens that this view model pretty much needs everything, right? So close that. Let's see what else is in here. Order details. Okay, so this one's interesting. So this is, I don't know why this is getting all the orders. So it's getting every order for that particular user, and then filtering it out by the order ID. This seems a tad odd. Why would that be? Kind of lost in this one because I'm fairly certain there's just like a get async in the base EF repository that they had. Yeah, why would that be? Something I'm not thinking of, or is it just an oversight? Interesting. I don't know. That seems weird to me. What do we got? Interfaces here. Basket. So what's all this stuff related to? Basket view model. Why am I not seeing those quote-unquote features? Are they listed somewhere else? Base catalog. So we got this catalog controller. I got it. So I think that maybe the gist here is that some of the stuff's using mediator and feature folders and some of it's not. I don't know if that's on purpose or if they just want to show different ways of doing this. Mainly just not kind of uniform, really. And then, yeah, I get the feeling that's probably the case here. Some of it's using it, some of it's not, because now we got this whole view model service to get catalog items. Weird. What's this one do? So this is user management. Yeah, this is just the normal user stuff. It's not that exciting. So to go back to what I was referring to, when I see this, like views, view models, all these things separated by technical concern, I guess would be it, if you were to throw it as in a technical bucket. I advocate not doing this. I advocate putting things that are related use together. So for example, when we were talking about the order view model, I'm fairly certain, like, and then order item view model, again, I would have those things directly together, and I would have this with that feature for getting the actual order view model. I despise having things in multiple files and multiple folders that you're digging around for. Again, argument for or against it is, hey, I can just kind of, you know what I mean, go to definition everywhere and hop around, and if that works for you, great. I find it easier to looking at stuff either in the same directory or directly in the same file. So I think where I may take this, what time is it right now? It is Been at this for half an hour. I think where I may take this is maybe I will. I'm trying to decide if I should do this actual refactor streaming or if I should do it offline. It's a good question. I gotta get comfortable doing this streaming thing here. Feels like you're talking to open space. At least when I'm doing it for my own videos, I realize I'm doing it, but it's kind of weird knowing that there are people watching. All right. I don't know if anybody watching does have any other examples that may be worthwhile to do what I'm talking about, is kind of separating into separate models and not using a repository. This is the first one I thought of, which I hadn't really looked at this before now. I mean, I briefly looked at it before I went live, but to know nothing more than a couple minutes, just to see if it was using a repository in EF, which I assumed it was. So I think what I might do is set aside some time where I will do exactly that. I'll pull this down and I will rejig probably at least this one. Maybe we'll do this one. I'll start off by having this not use the repository, and then I'll go a little bit more insane, or what most people think insane, is kind of merging some of this stuff together in terms of where these actual classes live. I think these specifications are useful. I just don't think they're very useful for I don't think they're very useful if they are used once. I guess that would be this separate way to put it. Because it's not like this thing, you're depending on this thing. So what it's implemented, like what it actually does, if you're testing this handler, is going to do what it's going to do. If you're only using that specification once, then the logic that's contained inside of it, that thing's encapsulating, I really don't know what benefit it serves. Because you could say, oh yeah, I need to how to customer orders with items to get that, you know what I mean, to pass that to this list. And like we said, this thing was doing include with the items and then doing a where, I think, on the username or something like that. If you're not doing that in multiple places, which I'm going to guess it was because we were doing it somewhere else, but then just filtering with the one order, which is not needed at all. Yeah, it just doesn't. To me, this just doesn't serve any purpose. Again, assuming it's only used once, but I guess I'll figure that out more when I pull this down and navigate the code in Writer. All right, that's I think where I'm going to leave this, but it gives me a good idea where I'm going to kind of start next with. Yeah, I'm just trying to think if I'm going to stream me refactoring this or if I'll just do it offline and post it as a YouTube video. I'm going to assume people watching this on YouTube are because they actually subscribe to the channel. I never really posted this on Twitter or anything that I was going to be doing this like immediately. I did last night, mainly because I wasn't sure what the heck was going to happen, whether I was going to get this working right or not. So I think what I'll do is maybe I'll try to do this again. If anybody's got any feedback, let me know on Twitter if you follow me there, or on YouTube. If you'd like to see me do anything different with that. But this just stemmed from kind of that thing I seen on Twitter about whether to eager load entities, which my answer is don't, because you don't bother using a repository or the aggregate for queries. So that's the plan. All right, I will post on Twitter again, and actually I'll post a message on YouTube if you don't follow me on Twitter about when I'm going to do this, and I'll probably do that refactoring maybe tomorrow. I'll try to kind of set a normal schedule about when I'm doing this, so, or maybe tonight. I guess we'll see how this goes. I know scheduling this is going to be a little bit weird. I probably have to figure out some specific time to do it if I make it a regular thing. So, all right, till then, Let's now figure out how exactly I stop recording. All right, thanks for checking it out, whoever's out there. Adios.